Well, thanks, Mike, and thanks everyone for joining us here today. As Mike said, I'm Brigadier General Lance Bunch, and I currently serve as the Chief of Future Operations at Resolute Support Headquarters. But before I begin, just yesterday, we were reminded of the constant danger our United States, coalition, and Afghan partners are in every day here in Afghanistan. A U.S. Army soldier died of injuries he sustained during a vehicle incident in Nangarhar province. On behalf of General John Nicholson, commander here, we send our most heartfelt condolences to his family. Just an update on those injured. In the hours that followed the incident, the additional U.S. Army soldiers who were in the vehicle are being provided medical evaluation for possible traumatic brain injury. So a total of 9 soldiers were in the vehicle. 1 died of his injuries, 2 were taken to a medical treatment facility for treatment of non-life-threatening injuries, and 6 are being evaluated for possible TBI. And so just 3 months ago, we stood up a Future Operations Division in Resolute Support. And that fact alone is noteworthy and at the core of what I want to talk to you about today. See, previously the mission here in Afghanistan was on a shrinking path to around 1,000 personnel with decreasing responsibilities. However, in August, when the President introduced the new South Asia policy and its new accompanying authorities, we transitioned from a time-based mission to one that is now conditions-based. As General Nicholson has stated, we will be here until the job is done. To get that job done, our new Future Operations, or FUOPS shop, developed a sustained air interdiction campaign, and for the first time in this war, a counter-threat revenue campaign. Using air power, we have been able to target the Taliban in their so-called safe zones, command and control nodes, illicit revenue generating ventures, and their logistical networks. This new air interdiction campaign directly strengthens the Afghan Defense Forces and their continued battlefield successes. Now, on November 20th, General Nicholson discussed the opening salvo of airstrikes against the Taliban's opium and heroin enterprise in northern Helmand. Today, I'd like to update you on what the Afghans and we have been able to accomplish in only 3 short weeks. Since the beginning of this campaign, we have eliminated 25 narcotics processing labs from the Taliban inventory. This equates to almost $80 million of drug money eliminated from the kingpins' pockets, while denying over $16 million of direct revenue to their Taliban partners. Keep in mind that this is the first time we have persistently used our air power in this interdiction role. While U.S. air interdiction has been very successful, it's not just the U.S. doing this work, and it's not just airstrikes that are having an impact at cutting off Taliban lifelines so effectively. Just last week, we released video footage from Helmand Province of our U.S. Marines' high-mobility artillery rocket systems that took aim at more Taliban narcotics processing facilities while still enabling the Afghan 215th Corps' continued offensive in Helmand. Additionally, the Afghan National Interdiction Unit conducted 2 simultaneous raids of Taliban narcotics bazaars as part of this integrated campaign. This resulted in over 2,000 kilograms of heroin and 5,000 kilograms of opium getting confiscated. The Taliban narcotics leadership was absolutely caught off guard, so we were then able to target Mullah Shah Wali, the Special Forces Branch or Red Unit commander of this Taliban squad in Helmand, delivering yet another blow to this criminal network. Again, the Taliban have never had to face a sustained targeting campaign focused on disrupting their illicit revenue activities. But let me be very clear about this campaign. This offensive was a joint effort between the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, the United States Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps, all collectively exercising authorities granted under the South Asia policy. And it's not over. In fact, it's only just begun. And this will be a very long winter for the Taliban, as we will continue to disrupt their revenue sources again and again and again. But a key part to these operations and our successful future operations are strong Afghan defense forces. Where before our Resolute support forces could only train, advise, and assist the Afghans at the corps level, The new South Asia policy will allow our forces to embed with Afghans all the way down to their Kandaks. This change allows our forces to train, advise, and assist Afghan units and leaders directly controlling the fight and accelerate their transition to increased capability and capacity. Additionally, the U.S. force uplift that was announced in the new South Asia policy has already happened. We had a portion of those new boots on the ground by September. Coupled with our air interdiction campaign, this strategy will allow Afghan defense forces to keep pressure on the Taliban through the winter. In early 2018, the new Security Force Assistance Brigade will deploy into theater and further enhance our advising of the Afghan defense forces going into the next fighting season. This effort will be a topic for a future briefing we have scheduled. We literally are taking the train, advise, and assist mission to a new level, the Kandak level, which we believe will mark yet another turning point in ultimately demonstrating to the Taliban that they cannot win. As we look back at 2017, we've seen many events unfold that reinforce our new, stronger commitment to the people and government of Afghanistan. Further, and more importantly, the Afghans are leading this fight. They want to own it, and they do. They demonstrate their sense of ownership every day on the battlefield. And for the Taliban, they have been completely unable to achieve any objectives from their declared Operation Mansouri during this fighting season. In addition to their unrealistic goals, they have been unable to take a provincial capital or even a single city. This year, the Taliban have fared poorly. In September, we saw how their extensive casualties forced their corrupt leadership to direct a stop of combat operations and a return to high-profile attacks, kidnappings for ransom, and assassinations. These are heinous acts of violence that bring attention to their group and indiscriminately target the Afghan people, resulting in unimaginable suffering. But the momentum is clearly with the Afghan Defense Forces. Our coalition is proving the enemy's theory of victory is wrong. They believed they would win because we lacked political will. They underestimated us, and they underestimated the will of the majority of the Afghan people. 87% of the Afghans believe the Taliban is bad for Afghanistan. So if Resolute Support's new FUOP shop is successful, the future of Afghanistan is one free of terror, corruption, and narcotic production. The government of Afghanistan is committed to a stable, secure nation for its people. The hard work, sacrifice, and investment of our 39-member coalition is helping build the Afghan National Defense Security Forces and delivering on a coherent vision. And we, together with our Afghan partners, are on the path to victory. We are working to achieve negotiated settlements, to reduce violence to manageable levels, and to facilitate a safe, secure, and prosperous Afghanistan. And with that, I look forward to your questions.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, as a reminder, please limit your questions to one and one follow-up. Idris, we'll start with you. Reuters?
Actually, I have two questions. The first one...
That was quick.
That's a follow-up.
The first one, I mean, you provided a fairly optimistic view of the situation in Afghanistan, but it won't be worth much unless you can disrupt the flow of fighters into Pakistan, sort of the cross-border flow, which has been an issue for the past decade and a half. What specifically are you doing to disrupt that flow of fighters into Pakistan? And do you believe you have the authorities to disrupt that?
Well, the issue of Pakistan is obviously a very important one that the State Department is taking for action. And of course, we just saw Secretary Mattis engage in Pakistan. And for follow-up to that visit, you could talk to Mike and the defense team there. What we do inside Afghanistan is we look for any opportunity to target the enemies of Afghanistan wherever we find them in the theater. And we have the authorities we need now to be able to target them. Whereas before, we could only target essentially in defense or in close proximity to Afghan forces that were in contact. Now, with our new authorities, we're able to target networks, not just individual fighters.
Second question then is, you do have new authorities. Do you believe you have enough JTACs to sort of carry out these, a larger number of strikes, or do you believe this, troops will have to take more of a risk with these new authorities and the lack of JTACs?
So currently our planning enables us to leverage the forces that we have on hand to use them to the maximum ability that we can while minimizing the risk to our own forces. So anytime we have forces out on the ground, of course, we provide them with all the support they need to minimize the risk to them, realizing that the majority of the air interdiction campaign is minimizing the risk to force by using just aerial assets in most cases against Taliban criminal illicit revenue ventures.
Rial Ragabor, Asia Times.
Thank you very much, sir. My two-part question. One, in the past, the higher level of Afghan leadership have been blaming Pakistan. Now, this new policy, can I ask you, sir, that can you have the peace and stability in Afghanistan without the full cooperation from Pakistan? And second, what role do you think now in the new policy India should play?
Well, Mike, you're breaking up a little bit there. Mike, can you relay that question for me?
Hold on, we're going to get a microphone. Over.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Yes, sir, sorry. My question again. In the past, at the higher level, Afghanistan leadership have been blaming Pakistan, not cooperating or terrorizing the people in Afghanistan. Now, under the new policy, can you have peace and stability in Afghanistan without the full cooperation of Pakistan? And second, what role do you think India should play in this new policy? Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. The current government, President Ghani, CEO Abdullah, are completely reliable partners as we look to enable the government of Afghanistan and the ANDSF forces across the theater to increase their capability and capacity and continue to have success on the battlefield. The role of Pakistan or India in the future with Afghanistan will be determined by the government of Afghanistan. And of course, our State Department is heavily engaged with both of those nations as we look to find common ground in the future.
Morgan, Politico.
Hi, sir. Thanks for doing this. You mentioned that the big part of this uplift is that you're putting advisor teams at Kandak level. We know that that's already happened in the past with special operations advisors, but can you just clarify or confirm that there are now already conventional force advisor teams down at the Kandak level? And if so, is there any way you could tell us how many Kandaks have these advisor teams?
So the uplift that was announced with the new South Asia strategy is already flowing into theater, and we do already have the authorities to start to advise at the Kandak level. You mentioned special operations forces. As you know, the Afghan special operations forces are the most lethal in the country, making up only 6% of the overall ANDSF, yet conducting over 70% of the offensive operations, and most noteworthy, have never been defeated on the field of battle. Our intent as we roll in the new Security Force Assistance Brigade in 2018 is we will embed those advisors across the theater to the Kandak, down to the Kandak level, across the theater to look to maximize our effect in key population centers so that we can have the maximum impact on the SAJOA for the ANDSF.
Okay, so you have the authorities now to start to advise at the Kandak level, but are you doing it? Are there advisor teams now, today, at the Kandak level, other than the special operations guys?
So our Security Force Assistance Brigade will be on the ground, specifically trained to conduct those advisor teams. We're looking to field those in the early part of next year, March of 2018 timeframe.
At a no, I mean, the forces already in theater don't have conventional advisor teams at the Kandak level?
Our current forces are uplifted, and we can advise at the CANDAC level, and we do advise at the CANDAC level. But the specific, I think what you're asking, the specifically trained advisor teams, the Security Force Assistance Brigade will not be in theater until the March timeframe.
Right, just to clarify. I'm not really asking about the SFAB. I just am asking about the forces already in theater. So there are now teams, whether they're from the forces already in theater, there are teams at the CANDAC level.
So I'm afraid we're talking past each other. So currently we do have the authorities, we do have the uplift, and in areas where it would be beneficial, we could go forward and start to advise at the CANDAC level. We're still postured to advise at the core level, and we'll continue to develop that capability as we transition to be fully operational when the Security Forces Assistance Brigade shows up in March. I think that better answers your question.
We can follow up later on that. Courtney Cubey, NBC.
Hi, General. One quick follow-on to Idris's question. When you said that the U.S. has the authority to target the enemies of Afghanistan wherever you find them, his question was specifically about Pakistan. So are you saying that the U.S. has the authority, U.S. military, to conduct strikes in Pakistan? And if so, have you done so under these new authorities?
No, I clearly meant that we are only doing targeting inside of Afghanistan, inside of the combined joint operations area in Afghanistan, and we don't have the authorities, nor are we conducting operations in Pakistan. No, that's not what I said, nor what I intended.
Okay, and then if I could ask one other question, can you just give us a very basic look at the threats in Afghanistan right now, sort of like an enemy layout in the country? Where is the biggest threat to ISIS or by ISIS? How many ISIS fighters are there? Where is the biggest Taliban threat right now? And roughly how many fighters there are? Can you just give us sort of like a basic battle update?
So there are, Afghanistan is the single largest collection of violent extremist organizations in the world for us, and we look to target them where they are. It's been previously reported ISIS-K in Nangarhar, Kunar, and we assess that they've got up to maybe 1,000 fighters. In Taliban, there are pockets of Taliban around the country, and we could give a more specific, detailed answer to that response later. I don't have that graphic with me, nor those exact numbers. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
We'll take that. Ryan Brown, CNN.
Hello, General. Thank you for doing this. Just a couple quick kind of asset questions. Do you currently have the ISR assets you need to conduct the air campaign, or are you kind of waiting on additional assets to flow over from the ISIS fight in Iraq and Syria? There have been talk about that going well, needing to free up some additional assets. And you said that we weren't postured at the CANDAC level yet in terms of advisors. We were kind of told that having advisors at the CANDAC level would allow for airstrikes to be called in direct support of Afghan forces. So do you not have that ability to do that because the advisors are not yet postured at that level? Thank you.
Okay, so I'll take the first part of that question. Let me take a quick note so I can answer both of yours. Okay, so ISR and our ability to conduct our air interdiction campaign. So we're currently already unfolding the air interdiction campaign, and we've been able to be extremely successful. Like I said, 25 narcotics labs, $16 million from the Taliban, and over $80 million denied to drug traffic organizations. We continue to leverage our ISR across the theater to find the enemy wherever they may be so that we can develop targets. There's been much said that as the war in Iraq and Syria starts to wind down, that the main effort will shift, if you will, to Afghanistan. And as those assets become available and come to us, we'll of course be able to leverage them and use them to full effect. And then secondly, the ability to advise at the CANDAC level and enable airstrikes. We've been highly successful across the battlefield this year. As you'll see, the ANDSF has conducted their combat operations through 2017 with the lowest level of support from the coalition forces in the 16-year war here, and yet has had some of the most success they've ever had, showing that they are in fact leading the fight, and we are there to advise and enable them. Key pieces you're seeing is that the Afghan Air Force itself, one of the more lethal organizations they have, and one that we're looking to triple in size by 2023, is conducting significantly more air operations in direct support of the ANDSF on the battlefield, to the tune of 500 more sorties this year than they did the year before. And so we are currently able to work with and enable the Afghan National Defense Forces as they conduct successful combat operations on the battlefield. We're working with the Afghan Air Force to continue to build their capacity, and we think that as we get those Security Force Assistance Brigade on the ground in March and are able to embed all the way down to the CANDAC level in a more robust manner, that we'll continue to bring those enablers from the U.S. to enable the ANDSF to have even greater success in 2018.
Lucas Thomason, Fox.
General, you said it's the first time the U.S. military has bombed Taliban revenue sources in the drug trade. Why did it take more than 16 years for the U.S. military to adopt this strategy?
I can't speak to why it's taken us so long. What I can tell you is that the new strategy highlights that this is a new war, and that the gloves are off, if you will, and that we've got now these authorities we need to be able to go and target the Taliban network. With the air interdiction campaign, we are able to go after the Taliban support structure, whereas before we could only strike essentially in defense of the ANDSF forces that were in contact with the enemy. And so now we're able to go after their weapons cache sites, their revenue generation, their C2 nodes, all the areas where they thought they were safe, and they are no longer so. And so that is our new strategy going forward. It has definitely been a game changer, and the Taliban is definitely feeling it.
And so because of this, you say that the war is now at a turning point, yet over Thanksgiving, the top general in Afghanistan, General Nicholson, said the war is still in a stalemate. Who's right?
So I think what General Nicholson said is that we're in a stalemate, but the momentum is definitely shifting to the ANDSF forces. As you see that momentum shift and you see the capability gap between ANDSF, which has been extremely successful on the battlefield in 2017, where the Taliban were unable to accomplish any of their objectives and have now done the cowardly directive to transition away from combat ops to high-profile attacks, kidnapping for hire or for ransom, and assassinations, all of which indiscriminately target the Afghan people. I think you can see that the momentum is shifting in the favor of the ANDSF.
One small follow-up with this vehicle accident that killed the soldier and injured others. What caused this accident? Can you just tell us?
It was a non-combat accident. It's currently under investigation, and when we know more, we'll share it with you through Mike and the team there in Washington.
Who was it, and what caused?
Somebody
else can pick that up.
Aviation Week.
Hi, sir. Thanks for being here. I'm wondering if you could detail what assets were used in the most recent strikes. And specifically, I'm wondering if you used the Raptors, the stealth fighters, in the most recent strikes. And if so, and I know they've been used before, can you just tell me the rationale for using these very expensive fighters to strike drug labs instead of using like the A-29s, the Afghan A-29s, for example?
Yes, ma'am. So so far we've used B-52s with their new conventional rotary launcher. Of note, it was the single most largest number of precision munitions ever dropped from a B-52. We've used the F-22, and I'll come back to that to fully answer your question. We've used F-16s, we've used A-29s, we've used the HIMARS from the Marine Corps, and we've used FA-18s off the carrier all to support this, coupled with an entire over-the-horizon support of air refueling assets, JSTARS, and ISR assets, both over the horizon and those we have based in the theater. And so you ask, why did we use the F-22? We used the F-22 because we were going to strike targets that required very low collateral damage, and we needed the most precise weapon that we had at our disposal, and so that was the small diameter bomb carried by the F-22, which again allowed us to be extremely precise, minimize collateral damage, yet still target the Afghan or the Taliban narcotics labs and not cause any undue collateral damage.
To follow up, there are other platforms that carry that munition, though, the F-15s, for example, I believe. So how come they weren't used?
Oh, I'm really sorry. I couldn't hear what you said. Could you repeat that?
I said that there are other platforms.
Sir, she said that there are other platforms that can carry that, such as the F-15.
Yeah, there are other platforms that can carry that weapon as well. So I'm just wondering why those were not used.
It has to do with where we have the weapons and munitions in the theater, what assets have them available, and what we could call on in the time frame that we needed. At the time, the F-22 had the SDB, was the most precise weapon. That's the one we chose to match to the target.
Is there any talk of moving the F-22s to Afghanistan so they'd be closer for these kind of strikes?
Ma'am, I haven't heard any discussions of that.
Voice of America.
Thank you, General. First, a quick follow on the accident, the non-combat accident in the vehicle. What type of vehicle were these troops in?
Ma'am, again, that is an investigation that's ongoing. I don't have that data. Once we have the full data, we'll share it with you.
On the narcotic strikes, this time, the winter season is currently a time of regrouping for the Taliban in the past 16 years. Can you just explain about how you think, or whether or not you think this will prevent their capability to regroup in preparation for the fighting season that starts usually in March or April?
Yes, ma'am. So we're actually targeting counter-revenue targets. We're looking for opportunities to disrupt the Taliban's ability to fund their operations, to recruit fighters, or buy weapons. Through that, in the near term, we're going after narcotics labs in northern Helmand, as we've talked about previously. Of note, the Taliban has gets between $300 and $500 million a year as their total budget. 60% of that, or almost $200 million, comes from the narco processing trade. The vast majority of that comes from northern Helmand, which is their economic engine, if you will. So we targeted there to disrupt their revenue, to prevent their ability to reset or refit over the winter. We will continue to target them and disrupt them wherever we find them.
And then my question after those two follows, my question is, do you have any comments or are you concerned about the ICC investigation of potential war crimes and crimes against humanity in Afghanistan? We hear that they are also investigating U.S. Strikes during that process. Thank you.
Ma'am, I'm not familiar with that whole process. We can get the appropriate people to answer that question at a later time.
Take that. That's a policy question. We'll take that, sir. Sean Snow.
Thank you for doing this. Have there been any requests or discussions to bring A-10s back to Afghanistan?
The discussions of what forces may move to Afghanistan or drawdowns from Iraq and Syria are all ongoing. They'll all be conditions based on both what happens in Iraq and Syria and what happens here. We've not made any decisions at this time to move A-10s that I know of.
Thank you.
Elizabeth McLaughlin, ABC.
Hi, General. What capabilities do you not have right now that you wish you had?
Currently, the forces that we have are enabling us to help the ANDSF go on the offensive. They are enough that keep the ANDSF on the offensive through the winter months. Again, in 2017, the Afghan forces conducted successful offensive operations with the lowest level of support from the coalition in the history of this conflict, and they were extremely successful. The Afghans are in the lead, and we're just here to support them and enable them, and we continue to do so and continue to be successful, as you've seen from our recent strikes.
There's nothing you would want, no further capabilities, no further authorities that you wish you had that you think would help the fighting season going into 2018?
Ma'am, we have the authorities that have been provided to us. We're using them to the maximum extent that we can, and we're having tremendous success on the battlefield.
So please state your name and outlet.
Brian Everstein with Air Force Magazine. I was hoping you'd talk a little bit more about the capabilities of the Afghan Air Force. I know the wintertime is big for the TAC Air guys over there to address their lines of effort. Specifically, their main focus is looking at day and night CAS and airlift with Afghan forces on their own. Are they capable of doing that now? What's the progress toward that? And you had said 500 more sorties so far this year. Do you have strike numbers? I know it was about 1,700 last year. Do you know where we are this year on just Afghan Air Force strikes?
So I don't have the Afghan Air Force strike numbers in front of me. We can get that data back to you. As we continue to build out the Afghan Air Force, we've had some near-term successes, and we have some plans going forward. So as you know, the first 4 UH-60 Blackhawks were delivered to the Afghan Air Force, and the first 6 pilots have already graduated from training. We expect to have 8 full crews at the beginning of the fighting season in 2018, and those Blackhawk helicopters are just the first of up to 159 that we're going to provide to them. The Afghan Air Force also conducts aerial resupply with their C-130 and C-208 aircraft, and then they've got their Mi-17s for helicopter lift in the near term as it's being transitioned to the UH-60. They've got the A-29, which has been very successful and continues to build into a very viable platform. Of note, the first strikes as part of this air interdiction campaign were conducted by the Afghan Air Force, where we worked with them to deliver targets that they then went and struck to start that entire campaign. The MD-530, again, continues to be a very effective helicopter in support of the Afghan forces at the front. And all of those, each of those weapon systems I just mentioned continue to grow in both capacity with additional airframes and additional crews.
Are the Blackhawks flying operationally now since those crews just graduated, or what's the timeline going ahead for operational flights?
I don't have the exact timeline for when the Blackhawks will be fully operational. We're on track to have 8 full crews with Blackhawks available for the beginning of the 2018 fighting season in the early spring.
Wes Morgan, Politico.
To follow up on Courtney's question about different enemy groups, can you tell us how often are you striking Al-Qaeda targets relative to, we hear about the Taliban and ISIS, but how often are you striking Al-Qaeda targets? And where do counter Al-Qaeda efforts fit into your future operations planning?
So our number one priority here is to continue to build the capacity of the Afghan Defense Forces. We're doubling the size of the Afghan Special Operations Forces. We're tripling the size of the Afghan Air Force, the 2 most lethal components. And those units continue to conduct operations. As I mentioned, the Afghan Special Forces are only about 6% currently of the overall Afghan Defense Forces, yet they conduct over 70% of the operations. They conduct those operations against all enemies of Jaroa, whether they be ISIS-K, they be Taliban, they be Haqqani, they be Al-Qaeda. We look to target across the theater where and when the enemy presents themselves.
So it sounds like you may not have the numbers now, but would you be able to get us numbers on how often there are U.S. airstrikes against Al-Qaeda targets?
We have that data. We could get it to you later.
Okay, I'm at the end of the queue. Doesn't look like there's any other questions. Sir, do you have any closing remarks? One more question. Whoop. We do have one more.
Just to follow up on the small diameter bombs that you talked about, I'm wondering if there's a shortage of this type of weapon at other places in the region that perhaps the F-15s were at, and maybe if that's part of the reason that the Raptors had to be used.
Ma'am, the shortage or how many munitions of that of the small diameter bomb did not enter into the equation. We looked to match the best aircraft with the most precise weapon against the target that was required, and in this case, that was the F-22 with the small diameter bomb.
Lucas Fox.
General, can you talk about the coordination with CIA ground branch officers on the ground? Has there been increased reliance on them, or is now that there's more U.S. troops on the ground, you're less reliant on those forces?
So I work with the conventional forces and supporting the ANDSF, and that would be outside of my lane of what you're talking about.
Thank you, sir.
Any other questions? Okay, sir. Do you have any closing remarks?
Yeah, everybody, I thank you for your time and the questions today, the ability to talk about the good work that we're doing here in Afghanistan. I'd like to highlight 3 key points: that the Taliban strategy is moving backwards. As they are unable to conduct offensive combat operations, they have transitioned back to high-profile attacks, assassinations, and kidnapping for ransom, all of which indiscriminately target the Afghan people. The momentum here has clearly changed, and the combat capability gap between the Afghan Defense Forces and the Taliban has never been greater. And we will continue to reinforce that as we've transitioned to this conditions-based approach and our ability to embed at the Kandak level and get as close to the units and leaders that are directly controlling the fighting in 2018. And then lastly, these are new efforts that have never been tried here in Afghanistan, whether it be a dedicated air interdiction campaign against networks, not just fighters, or a sustained counter-revenue campaign against the Taliban. These are new, the war has changed, and we look forward to talking to you more in the future and highlighting the successes of the ANDSF and the government of Afghanistan. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, General, for your time. Stay safe, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's briefing. Happy holidays. Merry Christmas.